Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and I wanted to go over the top 10 features that I like about Windows 8. Now, I feel like Windows 8 gets a lot of negative press and, in fact, a lot of bad feelings. And people get really fixated on the user interface and things that maybe IT people don't care about, especially Microsoft marketing. It's all around touchscreens and tablets. But there's actually a lot of cool things in Windows 8 that I think make it much easier for me to use on a daily basis, just kind of being a computer nerd, but also people who need to use it professionally, like the IT folks. So I'll start out. This is the full list of the 10 Windows features that I'm going to go through, but just like in the training course, I don't spend a lot of time on static slides. It's almost all demonstration. So I'll just get right into it, and I'll show off that WinX menu. Now, if you're curious, I'm doing all this from a virtual. Now, the WinX menu, as the name kind of implies, is opened by holding down the Windows key and pressing X. And it's just this cool little shortcut menu here. And it lets you launch lots of common tools that you might need to access. So if you're a keyboard jockey like myself, you can pop up Computer Management Console just that quick. There's also a mouse shortcut for it. Just right-click in the lower left corner. So it's that fast. And you can, immediately pop up your Task Manager, for example. That's all there is to it. You can extend the WinX. I do cover the rest of this in a lot of detail, including Task Manager, which I think is super cool. This is the default view of Task Manager, and you can see it shows you almost nothing. But if you've used the Windows 7 Task Manager, once I click more details, it shows me some familiar tabs with just a lot more information than I ever got in Windows 7. And this information really helps you immediately identify apps that are causing problems. So you can see I don't have anything especially busy here, but in Windows 7, it was really easy to sort by processor time and figure out which app was using the most processor. But if you wanted to find out which app was really burning through your disk and making all that noise, it was not an easy thing to find. And the same thing with the network. And just on the default tab, the Processes tab here, I can quickly identify whichever app is bogging down my network and slowing things down or making my hard drive grind like that. And then, right-click it and close it if you want to. It's that fast. They've also improved the Performance tab capabilities, but I just like the charts here a lot better. You can view the activity on each of your different disk drives and, of course, on your network as you could before. The App History tab is really cool here. Unfortunately, it only applies to what they call the Windows Store apps, which are, I'm not supposed to say Metro, but it's the Metro apps. These are the apps that are designed specifically for Windows 8 with the immersive interface designed to be touch-friendly. So the App History shows you what apps have been doing in the past. And as an IT guy, you know how important this is to you because people will come to you and they'll say that their computer's slow and you're like, I need a little more information than that. Well, you can open up the App History tab and see exactly which apps they've been using, which apps are using the most networking resources or processor time. Knowing which apps use the most networking resources is really useful if you're on like a 3G connection, like a wireless broadband connection that's metered, that gets charged. You can see Task Manager even separates the metered networks that you're probably paying for from the free networks like Wi-Fi or Ethernet where you're probably not paying per bit. The Startup tab, well, in the past, malware would always try to start automatically, so it would add itself to one of like 20 different places in earlier versions of Windows where an app could start automatically, and good luck trying to track down the random apps that might start automatically. The Startup tab here just provides a central place to see everything that's configured to start automatically. So you can see it, like I said, this is a virtual machine. So the guest editions start automatically on it. And if I don't want them to start automatically, I can just right-click it and click Disable. So if, AOL Instant Messenger is starting automatically and you're sick of it because it's not 1988 anymore, you can just right-click it and click Disable and it's gone forever. It's that fast. The Users tab shows you what different users might be logged on and what they're doing and how much processor they're using, just on this one PC, and I'm the only guy logged in. So The Details tab should look familiar because this is exactly what the Windows 7 Task Manager is. So, if you're feeling nostalgic and you want to take a trip down memory lane, or this is just familiar to you and you know exactly how to use it, you can jump over to the Details tab here, and it allows you to select the other columns just as you could in Windows 7 Task Manager, and easily sort by things. So it's basically there for backwards compatibility, I think, because I really like the Processes tab much better than the Details tab, but the Details tab is more like Windows 7. And finally, the Services tab shows you which services are running and the process ID for each. You can sort it here to see which ones are running and which ones are stopped, and find the actual computer name, which you might use to identify it. If you wanted to say start it from net start at a command prompt, you would have to type net start ALG versus the friendly name. So it's a useful index. I think it's much more accessible than going all the way to the services console tool. Anyway, Windows 8 Task Manager, one of my favorite features. Another super cool feature is storage spaces. Now, if you're like me, in my other life, I'm a photographer, and photography takes up a lot of disk space. So I have, a dozen various hard drives from different eras, and 500 gigabytes, 1 terabyte. I would always buy whatever the biggest drive was at the time. But then when the next bigger drive came out, I would buy that. And I have all these drives sitting around just doing nothing. So I'll show in the disk management tool here. You can see there are 4 different drives here that are unallocated. I have there's a 1 gig drive or 1 terabyte drive, a 2 terabyte drive, and then a 500 gigabyte drive, and another 1 terabyte drive here. So I've just connected 4 assorted random disks to this Windows 8 PC. And in Windows 7, there was no great way to use all these. You could format them all, but then you'd have to remember, like, oh, I put that on my documents folder, on my E drive, or my F drive, or my G drive, and you'd try to remember where all these different things were. And then, one day you'd suddenly fill up your E drive, and you'd have to try to shuffle it over to another drive that had enough space. And it was just a pain to manage all these different drives. And, for me, I would tend just to replace them. I would just buy one big drive and then throw them all away. Well, now you can keep using these things because storage spaces just takes all the different random drives that you have and makes them useful again in a way where you don't have to manage the space or what you're storing on which drive. It takes physical drives and connects them into one logical unit and uses space logically, and it gives you the ability to provide redundancy, just like RAID. But the problem with RAID was, if you wanted to set up a RAID 5 array, Windows could do that, but you'd have to have identical drives. Or if you had one 500 gigabyte drive and then 3 1 terabyte drives, well, it would shrink the volume down to the smallest of the drives. So you'd end up just using half of your 1 terabyte drives. Makes no sense. Storage spaces finally makes sense. So I just opened up storage spaces by searching the settings, and now I'll click create a new pool and storage space. And of course, UAC is still here. And now it's showing me all the drives on my computer that aren't formatted. Now when you move a drive into storage spaces, it's going to format it. So if you have anything that you love on there, copy it somewhere else because it's going to remove it for you. So it's select all these drives by default. And I'll just click create pool. And you can see it takes just a couple of seconds. And this is basically all there is to it. It's this easy. Now, it lets me assign a drive letter, of course, and give it a volume name just as if it were a physical drive. Resiliency type here is the redundancy that I was talking about. I don't know why I guess resiliency is a nicer name, but it is basically redundancy. And if you choose simple resiliency, it's basically like striping. That means I have 4 drives in this computer. If I pick simple resiliency and any one of those 4 drives fails, all my data is gone because they're all acting as a single array. And I guess it's a little scary because if you have your data on one drive, well, you have all your eggs in one basket, but if you have 4 drives and any one of them can fail, it's like having all of your eggs in 4 different baskets. Like you can just lose one of those drives and all your data is gone. And of course, the odds of losing 1 out of 4 drives is much higher than the odds of losing just a single drive. So if you do start to combine a bunch of drives like this, it's really good to enable resiliency. And you can see they have several options. Now, parity here is the most efficient. And this works basically like RAID 5 or RAID 6. It uses some complex math that I am not smart enough to understand. And it protects your data by copying little portions of it to different drives. Anyway, with Parity, you can lose one out of however many drives you have and still keep your data. But it slows things down a little bit because it makes the computer do some extra math whenever you write data. Now, the two-way mirror here is basically mirroring, but it doesn't work exactly like mirroring. It's a little more sophisticated than that, and it can use space a little more efficiently than just mirroring, at least if you have drives of varying sizes. It also lets you later add in more drives of any capacity, and it'll make whatever use of it you can. But with a two-way mirror, you can lose a drive and continue using your data. You won't lose any data. You just need to swap another drive in there to restore your resiliency. And with a three-way mirror, say that again. And with a three-way mirror, you can actually lose 2 drives, 2 out of my 4 drives, and I could continue accessing my data. That's a lot of resiliency, and just in case I have 2 drives fail, or I have 1 drive fail, and I'm just too lazy to ever replace it. So you can see that between those 4 drives, I had a total capacity of 4.5 terabytes, about 4.5 terabytes. And if I put in a three-way mirror, I only get to use about 1.5 terabytes of it because it has so much redundancy. But if I go to Parity, I get to use 3 terabytes out of my 4.5 terabytes. So this is just really cool. This is like a really sophisticated and efficient and easy to use form of RAID. So I'm going to click Create Storage Space here at the bottom, and it's going to set it up. And I don't really need to fast forward through this. It goes pretty quickly. Just let this go. There we go. So it's prompting me up here. I can, I'll just choose to view it in File Explorer so we can see that it's real. Look at the properties for that drive. There you can see about 3 terabytes of space from the random assorted drives. It's all on one volume that's bigger than any of the different drives was. I can just copy my files over there and I don't have to worry about them filling up. And later, if I start to get low, I can go buy one of those new 4 terabyte drives that I'm drooling over now, connect it in, and it will just grow by however much space it can. If I'm using Parity, it won't be a full 4 terabytes because it'll have to protect some of the data, but it will grow quite a bit. And of course, this is the Manage Storage Spaces control panel tool where you can go in and manage it. So you can see here I can browse the 4 different physical drives that are associated with it. If one of these drives fails, it'll show up here. It'll become a red X. And really important here, add drives. This is what you do whenever you buy a new drive and you want to expand that space a little bit. Anyway, storage spaces is a real blessing if you're like me and you're always running out of disk space and you're always buying new drives and you don't have to transfer any stuff over. Just find a way to plug that new drive in and you'll instantly add space. I also think so on touch screen, it's kind of hard. In which case it becomes a real pain to log in. So you can pick a picture of your choosing and then just draw lines, shapes, or dots on the screen to log in, and you get 3 different shapes to choose. So I'll pick a picture here because my wife and I went out doing some bird photography this morning, and I was pretty happy with this picture. So this is 2 crows chasing off an owl, but it's actually a good picture for picture passwords because you want to choose a picture that has a certain number of points of interest. So one of these, like pictures of fog, wouldn't be great. You need sharply defined points of interest that you can mark. So, like I said, you can draw lines, circles, and dots. So the simplest of the gestures is just a dot. So maybe I'll draw a dot on the left crow's eyes here. Then, I could think to myself, well, the crow is clearly looking at the owl, so I'll draw a line from here to here. And you can also I'll draw circles, both small circles and large circles. So I'll just circle the owl's eyes here. And I found actually that I'm pretty terrible at remembering these gestures. I'm good at remembering passwords, but I guess I'm just not as practiced with picture passwords. So don't be surprised if I forget these. But it asked me to repeat it. It's a little bit of practice. And I succeeded. Let's see if I can remember it long enough to log off and log back on. So I'll just log off so we can see how it works. There we go. Okay. So this is what you see when you log in. Like I said, this is mostly for people with tablet computers, but it makes it much faster to log in. So what did I say? A dot there, and then a line here, and then a circle there. Now, I think a lot of people say, oh, picture passwords, that doesn't meet my security requirements. And maybe it doesn't, but I also think it's not that bad. Now, first, picture passwords don't make anything more secure because you can always revert to your password. If you forget your picture password, which I do all the time, you can just end up typing it. So it's adding a second way to log in. Therefore, there's no way it's making things more secure because now somebody could hack in with either your picture password or your regular password. But it's not that bad because there are actually 5 separate gestures for every point of interest or every separate or every pair of points of interest on a picture. So the more complex your picture, the more possible points of interest, and therefore the more possible combinations there are, and the more secure your picture password is. You can draw lines in either direction between any 2 points of interest, and you can draw small circles and large circles, both clockwise and counterclockwise. So actually that makes more than 5. What is that? 7 different types, as well as simple dots. That leads to millions and billions of combinations, and it only lets you try 5 different picture passwords. Another security concern that some people have is that from a tablet computer, you'll be able to see these smudges on the screen, and that's a possibility. But even if you can see the smudges on the screen, I did the math here, it's basically cryptographically impossible for somebody to guess it, because you would then have to guess the direction and the sequence. And it's only going to give you 5 guesses before it makes you log in with a regular password. So somebody would need physical access to your touchscreen computer and then a whole lot of luck, like a massive amount of luck. Anyway, turns out it's just not practical. So next I would like to discuss Freudian slip there perhaps, to discuss Windows Store apps. And these are all Windows Store apps. And Windows Store apps are these immersive full screen apps, which my screen resolution happens to be too low to run right now. They require, I think, 768 vertical pixels on the screen, and because for the sake of the demonstration, I'm not using that. But it's not important for what I'm going to talk about. The nice thing about Windows Store apps is they run in a sandbox environment. So it's like every app is running in its own virtual machine. You control the permissions really, really tightly. And every app goes through the Microsoft approval process, which means if somebody tries to put up some malware on there, something that's going to, I don't know, take a look at your files and send it off to some random internet server, Microsoft will hopefully detect this in the code and prevent it from being on there. So it's not like it's foolproof. Something could and probably will at some point slip through, but it's so much more secure than just searching the web for an app and downloading it and then installing it, and you don't know who it came from or what it's doing on your computer. And that's the way all of what they call the Windows 32 apps are. They basically have free reign over your computer. And, you know, since Windows Vista and Windows 7 as well, there's some user level security. You log on as a standard user, and if an app wants to do something that requires administrative privileges, like changing your Windows settings, it would need to prompt you with a UAC prompt. But frankly, these user account control prompts aren't that secure because everybody I've found just clicks through them anyway and ignores them. So they become a little annoying and a little too familiar. But Windows Store apps, they have to declare the permissions that they're going to use. They have to have a good reason for, say, accessing your documents or files. They can only access your documents through a file open dialog box. So basically you have to go through and select something. They can't just go browsing your files and then sending it off to an internet location. Now, one of the concerns is I want to write my own Windows Store apps and I don't want to send it through Microsoft for approval. And in an enterprise, you can definitely do that. You can sign your own apps and distribute them throughout your organization. Pretty much requires an Active Directory domain. I mean, there are ways for developers to run apps that haven't been approved, but it's difficult enough that you wouldn't want to do it on a large scale, and Microsoft does that intentionally because they don't want people going to the internet and just downloading random apps from random websites, which might have who knows what kind of malware, Trojan horses, rootkits, bootkits, whatever. Anyway, the Windows Store really does a great job of protecting you from that. Now, this is if you get your apps from the Windows Store. You still have a desktop, so you can go in and browse the web and download whatever desktop apps you want. But as long as you're working in Windows Store apps, you can rest assured that the security is much better. Now, I'm also going to go quickly over some what I think are some cool mouse controls. You can move your jump back to the start screen here. You can move your cursor up to the upper left corner and just immediately jump back to the previous app. You can also pull down here to dock an app to either side of the screen. And again, I'm a little bit limited by the resolution of the screen here. I can't do that. I mentioned before that you can right-click in the lower left corner, and it will pop up the Windows X menu. That's pretty useful. Let's see. Nope, I won't be able to run that. You can also left-click down here, and it will switch to the most recent app, or go back to the Start menu. So you can do a lot without taking your hand off the mouse. And if you're kind of a efficiency nerd like me, if you're trying to get your work done just as fast as possible, so maybe you can get off the computer, the new mouse and keyboard controls too allow you to do that much faster. So for some of these things in the past, you might have had to move your hand from your mouse to your keyboard. You get a lot more done with your hand on your mouse, and I find that just makes work go quicker once you spend a few minutes learning how the controls are. Now, a lot of people, one of their biggest complaints about Windows 8 is none of it's intuitive. And this is so true. Nobody would know to go up here and put your mouse in the upper left corner to make the previous window appear. But the same thing is true of the first iPhone and the first Android phone and the first iPad. All these different devices, we had to learn the user interface. It was 5-6 years ago, so it feels like it's part of who we are now. We just know it inherently. And Windows 8 is different. But you have to spend a few minutes learning it. But I promise, 5-10 minutes going through the user interface tutorials, and you're going to be working much faster. Anyway, I really like the new user interface enhancements that they've done in Windows 8. A couple other tricks, like you can drag an app from the toolbar up here down to close the window, or you can drag a desktop app to the top to maximize the window. Okay, so now I'd like to go back to the slides for a second and discuss Secure Boot. This is a really controversial feature, but I feel like all the negative aspects of it are way overrated because Secure Boot, well, it's the end of rootkits and bootkits. And if you don't know what these are the most evil form of malware you can imagine. Rootkits and bootkits install themselves on your computer in such a way that they start before Windows. They might even overwrite your computer's own BIOS. BIOS is the firmware that runs at the hardware level on your computer. Some rootkits can actually take over that hardware level of control of your computer. But for the most part, bootkits and rootkits start before Windows and then launch Windows. So they actually replace the Windows bootloader, and this gives them complete low-level control over your whole computer and makes them virtually undetectable. It's theoretically possible for you to completely be unable to detect a rootkit. Now, there are tools out there that can detect some of them, but there are bootkits out there that nobody's really going to know how to detect, and you might have it on your computer right now and not know it. And that's really scary because they have low-level access to your computer, which means they can see the password that you type in. They can capture your screen as they do it. They could turn on your webcam and film you whenever they feel like it. They can take your documents and send them across the internet. They can watch you log into your bank accounts. These are scary, and you don't know that you have them or you don't. And even if, look, I'm a computer nerd, and I've gotten malware on my computer many times, not because I'm doing risky things. I run everything risky in a virtual machine like I am now. but there were vulnerabilities that happened in software, including Google Chrome and Internet Explorer, and there were legitimate websites that get compromised many times. Legitimate websites have been compromised, and somebody will just go visit it with a fully patched browser, and it will install malware on their computer, and that can include rootkits and bootkits. So you can be tech savvy, you can be a security geek like me, and still get malware, including rootkits and bootkits, on your computer. There hasn't been a good solution until Secure Boot has come along. What Secure Boot does is first it requires a fairly new computer, a computer with UEFI firmware, which is a more recent version of BIOS, basically. This is the low-level software that runs at a hardware level, runs at a lower level than Windows. And it also requires a trusted platform module chip, a TPM chip, and that's a little security chip that just intelligently stores certificates and other little bits of security information, does some security processing, and it's basically super secure and kind of tamper-proof. So if you have a computer with both of those components, and including any Windows 8 certified PC, then you can use Secure Boot. And what Secure Boot does is when the computer starts up, it just checks your bootloader for a valid signature. Or it can check to make sure that it's a bootloader that you personally have approved, even if it's not Windows. And if it's not a bootloader that you trust, well, it won't start it. So let's say you're running Windows 8 and through no fault of your own, a rootkit or a bootkit installs itself. Well, the next time you restart your computer's not going to start. And this is a really good thing, because having a computer that won't start is way better than having a computer that starts with a rootkit on it, for all the reasons I was saying before. So at that point, you would know that your computer was compromised in some way, and you would just have to reinstall Windows. And in fact, depending on how that rootkit gets installed, Windows can actually automatically detect the presence of it and reinstall itself. So Windows can even automatically detect and remove some types of rootkits, but some of them will slip past, but they'll still get caught by the firmware. So basically, the Secure Boot and what Microsoft calls the Trusted Boot process ensures that from the moment you press the power button on your computer until you're able to log in, no bad software can get in. Now, this doesn't mean that you won't run bad software at the user level, but it won't be able to persist between reboots. So you'll be able to reboot and be pretty confident that your computer doesn't have any malware on it. In other words, every time you reboot a computer, it'll pretty much be clean. I personally don't know of anything that's gotten through the Trusted Boot security process yet. Theoretically possible. Nothing in security can ever be discussed in absolutes. I don't know what's going to happen. But it's a huge, massive step towards getting trusted software on our computers, that no more malware. Malware is such a massive expense to IT departments. I don't have the stats in front of me, but from what I recall, it's the single biggest expense to IT departments. It's just cleaning up computers that get malware on them. So the last point in the slide, I'm just saying, you can still multi-boot. The reason Secure Boot is so controversial is people thought Microsoft is taking control over every Windows 8 certified PC, which is going to be most PCs out nowadays, and they're not going to let me run my Linux or FreeBSD or whatever non-Microsoft software you might run. Yes, you can still multi-boot, you can still run Linux. In fact, several different distributions of Linux have gotten certified for Secure Boot, so you don't have to do anything special. They'll just install automatically and boot in a trusted way. But even if you modify the Linux kernel, if you make your own bootloader, you can still go into Secure Boot and configure it to be trusted. Part of the Windows 8 certification process requires that hardware manufacturers allow you to either completely disable Secure Boot or to trust your own bootloader. So every Windows 8 certified computer is basically certified for other operating systems too. No downside to Secure Boot as far as I can tell. This is an overview of the Secure Boot process. You can see this top part here is actually happening at the firmware level, the hardware level. And one of the features of UEFI is that it can have a checksum in it. Therefore, if a firmware rootkit comes in there and tries to overwrite the firmware, it should detect it and block it. The bootloader itself, the Secure Boot, just checks the signature with the checksum on the bootloader, whichever it is that you configure, and make sure that it's a trusted bootloader. Which means if a bootkit comes in to overwrite it, well, Secure Boot's going to stop it. It's not going to start anymore. And then Microsoft has this process called Trusted Boot and a separate process called Measured Boot. which in turn starts the kernel and then the boot drivers and then the system files. And every step of this process is checked. Every file is checked for the signature, and that means that it reads every byte of the file in, does some math on it, and verifies it against a digital signature that it has stored previously. So basically, software that's signed by Microsoft or that you as a user approve will boot, and nothing else. If you don't approve it, it won't start, meaning your system can be clean. ELAM down here is early launch anti-malware, and well, it's built into Windows Defender, and third-party anti-malware software can start it too. This is addressing a specific challenge with Windows 7 and early versions of Windows, was that even if you had malware started, well, malware wouldn't start here until the bottom, basically at the logon time, which is why malware always tries to start earlier in the process, because if malware can start before your full anti-malware starts, then it's free and clear. It can hide itself. ELAM makes that virtually impossible. It starts up early and checks every third-party driver, every non-Microsoft driver, to make sure that it's at least trusted. One second, I'll take a sip of tea. And measured boot is cool too. It's a process whereby the firmware itself takes a snapshot of every component that's loaded up before the full anti-malware starts and records it in the firmware, in the TPM chip. You can then send it off to a server in your organization, and the server will just make sure that every component that was loaded is trusted. And if it's not trusted, well, it doesn't have to let it on the network, or it can call an IT guy and say, hey, we got a computer that's running some unknown software on it. So, in other words, even if some part of this could be bypassed, even if something could get corrupted, this measured boot component could still catch it. Now, measured boot, Windows 8 supports it alongside Windows Server 2012, but it requires third-party software that doesn't exist to the best of my knowledge. So I'm kind of telling you what the vision of measured boot is. I haven't actually seen it in implementation, but hopefully soon. It's a really cool idea. It can keep computers, even if some part of this component, some part of this very secure process just happens to fail, it can keep them off your network, and it's just a little belt and suspenders security. Up next, I'm going to talk about Windows to Go, and this is an enterprise-only feature, so you won't be using this at home. Windows 8 Enterprise is an addition of Windows 8, like Windows 8 Pro, but it's specifically for enterprises. Basically, if you make your own custom image of Windows in an enterprise, you can copy it to a flash drive, and then take that flash drive and plug it into virtually any PC, as long as it's capable of running Windows 8 and booting from a flash drive, and boot your custom Windows 8 image. And this seems really simple, just booting from a flash drive, right? Except that because it's a custom image, you can give one of these flash drives to your employees and say, just take this home. And instead of just logging in with your own home PC, just plug it into your home PC and restart it. One second. Sorry, I don't talk this much on a daily basis, so I'm blowing my throat out a little bit, but you have your custom image of Windows 8 on the flash drive, and that means you have all your VPN shortcuts and all your approved apps. You can lock that down to meet your corporate security requirements, and any PC you plug it into will suddenly become a trusted operating system environment. And of course, it doesn't change the hardware at all. Somebody has a physical keylogger attached to their computer, well, it's still going to log their keys. But it can greatly improve your security, and it just allows you to put this customized image with familiar apps and shortcuts and VPNs and such onto whatever PC that they plug it into, even if it's like a hotel PC or something. It never writes to the drives. In fact, they're not accessible. You can't even read from the drives on the host computer. It's its own operating system installed from this flash drive. I'll also say that you can't just use any cheapo flash drive. You have to get one of these like certified flash drives, and they're pretty expensive for what they are. So you can end up spending more than $100 just on the flash drive itself. So it's not super cheap, but I bet those prices will come down pretty quickly too. Now I will talk about BitLocker used disk space only encryption. And this is such a simple feature, but it makes such a big difference. BitLocker is this technology that can encrypt an entire hard drive. And I suggest everybody use it on every hard drive. Basically, the entire hard drive will be encrypted. So if somebody sneaks into your office and either steals a hard drive from a computer or even steals an entire computer, depending on how you have that computer configured, they won't be able to access your data. So imagine you're going through the airport and you throw your laptop in one of those bins, and then I don't know, you're putting your shoes on and you don't notice, but somebody else grabs it and goes off with it. If you have BitLocker installed and your computer configured basically to require a password at startup, they will never be able to access your data, not even with modern cryptographic tools. I mean, government forensics, as far as I know, can't get through this BitLocker cryptography. So it can keep your data protected even when you're mobile. On the server side, somebody could break into a data center and they used to just be able to just grab the hard drives out of computers. They're meant to be easily replaceable, so it's a handle on the front, and you can pull it out and swap it out with a replacement if you want. Well, thieves could just come in and steal your hard drives. They did this. They'd take it home and read all the data. On the server side, because those are encrypted and could only be decrypted when it's connected to the computer, well, they don't have the server, they just have the drives, then all the data is encrypted. Here's the problem with BitLocker, though. It takes an awful long time to encrypt that first drive, and if you're trying to install it on 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 new PCs, turning on BitLocker encryption could take 24 hours depending on the size of the drive, because it would have to go through and encrypt every byte of data on the drive. And if you imagine adding 24 hours to the deployment process for thousands of PCs that are being installed in like an assembly line, it was a nightmare for IT guys. So BitLocker used disk space only encryption. Just encrypts whatever is used on the drive. It's only good for new drives because, if you have been using a drive for a while and you've saved confidential data and then deleted it, traces of that confidential data are still going to be on the drive. So you don't want to use it on old drives, but on new computers or on new drives, it can reduce the encryption time substantially. And I'll look at some metrics here. So these metrics are tests that I personally did as part of a project for Microsoft. So you might see this on the Microsoft site too, using removable flash drives. And removable flash drives they're any security nerd's greatest fear, because users use these flash drives to take big files home, therefore bypassing your VPNs and everything. They'll just plug a flash drive into the computer and copy all your confidential data to it. They probably mean well. They're probably going to go home and work on it. But they're like fishing through their pocket for their keys, and then it falls out and lands in the parking lot. The next guy comes along, he sees this flash drive and he plugs it into his computer, and well, he has all your secrets now. So what BitLocker to Go will do is encrypt these flash drives just like it does for the system drives. And unless you have a password, you can't get it. Really, it's really well encrypted. But as you can see from this chart here, an 8 gigabyte drive on USB 2 could take half an hour to encrypt. And if an employee is plugging their flash drive in to take some files home, they're not going to wait around half an hour. Well, if you turn on use disk space only encryption, it's going to take less than a minute. So that's a huge improvement. And of course, it has to encrypt all the existing files on the drive. So if you have a lot of data on there, it's still going to take some time. But for the most part, they're plugging in a brand new drive, and Windows 7 would encrypt every empty byte of data on there and take half an hour doing it. That'd be a real pain. And so here you can see USB 3 drives, the speed increases in about an equal percentage. Anyway, it's much faster, it's much more convenient, and suddenly it's much more usable. And that's the key to security. It's always a compromise between security and usability. And if you inconvenience users too much, they're going to find ways to bypass your security. So BitLocker, use disk space only encryption, makes BitLocker security much more usable, both for IT guys deploying it and for the end user who needs to take their files to go. The last feature I want to show off is just refreshing and resetting. So I'll jump back to my virtual machine here. I'm going to pull up the settings. There we go. I'm opening the Charms bar by pressing Windows C and then going to Settings. and then clicking Change PC Settings. And on the general page here, I'll just scroll down a little bit, and we see two options here, refresh and, well, it used to be called reset, now it says remove everything and reinstall Windows. Both of these really reinstall Windows. Refreshing takes a copy of all your files and data, everything in your user profile, and stores it to a little special new partition that it makes on the drive. Then it reinstalls Windows. Then it takes all the files that it saved to that partition and restores them. It'll also reinstall your Windows 8 apps, your Windows Store apps, but not your desktop apps. This option here, resetting, does not save a copy of your files anywhere. It just reinstalls Windows. Now, by default, if I were to do this, it would reinstall the default Windows 8 image, but as an IT guy, you can go in there and put in your own Windows 8 image. That way, a user who could be traveling on location somewhere who doesn't have access to your corporate network, he can be calling you and saying, hey, I think I got some malware on my computer. This thing's being a real pain. What can I do about it? And you can say, go to the general page in PC settings, and under refresh your PC without affecting your files, click get started. And he can walk through this process. It's super easy. And it's going to most definitely remove any malware. All right, you can see it wants me to insert my Windows 8 DVD, and frankly, it's not all that interesting to watch, but it takes probably 20, 30 minutes to refresh the PC, and then it will be back to a clean corporate image, or the default image of Windows with all their files intact. Now again, it's not perfect because it's kind of built around this, right now, imaginary world where everybody uses nothing but Windows 8 apps and there are no desktop apps, and I hope that'll be the future soon, because Windows 8 apps, just the architecture of them is so much better than desktop apps. Right now, if you refresh, like I said, you're going to lose all your desktop apps. But if you have it installed in the corporate image, well, they'll still be there because it's going to be restoring that corporate image. Now, you need to keep a copy of your corporate image on each computer if you want them to refresh, so it doesn't prompt them like it did me. But within just a few minutes, they can get back to a clean image no matter what happened to their PC, as long as the hardware is still working. So those are my top 10 features, and I believe now we have some time for some Q&A. Let's find my chat window here. All right, somebody says, the problem with BitLocker is that you can format the drive without password. I suppose so, but BitLocker is designed to protect the confidential data and, not to protect the drive from being modified necessarily. Of course, you could put a nail through the drive too and ruin the data on it, but as long as it's keeping the data safe, or keeping the data confidential, that's really the point of BitLocker. Does BitLocker encrypt on the fly? I'll say again, does BitLocker encrypt on the fly if you use the only use disk space option? And that's a really good question. And yes, it absolutely does. And in fact, when you're deploying a new computer with that option, it will enable BitLocker as one of the very first steps in the installation. That way, it has very little data to encrypt in that first pass. And then every new byte that is written to the drive after that is going to be automatically encrypted. Somebody asked, does Windows to Go require any special type of USB drive like ReadyBoost does? And yes, it does. It requires an outrageously expensive drive. And I know because I covered how to use Windows to Go in the video training course. Therefore, I had to buy one of these drives. And I bought a Kingston Data Traveler Workspace 32 gigabyte, which is absolutely the cheapest drive I could buy. And it was ridiculously expensive for a 32 gigabyte drive. So I took one for a team and bought one of these certified drives, and it worked. I also tried it with some other drives that I happen to have laying around, and didn't work. So the nice thing, the thing about the certified drives is they don't act like a USB flash drive. They act like a regular physical drive. In other words, they're impersonating like a USB external hard drive rather than a regular flash drive. And I don't know why that is required, but it seems to be required, and therefore regular flash drives just aren't going to work for you. Somebody else asked me how I like the game BioShock Infinite, and I've only played it like 5-10 minutes, but yes, it's cool. Okay, a few more questions here. Yeah, somebody asked if there's anything new in BitLocker in Windows 8 for client end or the enterprise, and I covered the use disk space only option, but there's another option, another new feature in BitLocker that I think is really cool, and that's the ability to unlock when you're connected to the corporate network. So with Windows 7, you can require a password when the computer starts to use BitLocker, and that's really the only way to really protect the contents of the drive in a secure way. Is basically before Windows starts, it makes you put in a PIN. And if you don't put that PIN in, then you can't get to any of the files. And in fact, Windows won't even start. Well, that's a real pain for administrators, because administrators sometimes like to schedule updates to install overnight, or they might be managing computers remotely and they need to restart them. Well, what happens when the computer goes to restart? It sits there waiting for somebody to put a PIN in. And if you're managing it remotely, you can't put that PIN in. So with Windows 8, you now have the option, with a little bit of infrastructure set up, to have the computer realize that it's connected to the corporate network and unlock itself automatically. And I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but it works, it's secure, and it allows all the desktop PCs in your organization to have BitLocker and password protection if they're removed from the network without the pain that is entering in the password every time when they are connected to the network. So I think that's a real convenience, and it will allow a lot of organizations to use BitLocker that would have previously avoided it because of that inconvenience. Okay, I think a couple more questions. Does the training video course cover all the necessary skills for the 70-687 Microsoft certification exam, which is configuring Windows 8? And I'll just say I did my best. I have passed like 35 Microsoft certification exams. I've written, I think, 28 books for Microsoft Press, training kits for Microsoft Press to help pass these different certification exams. I worked really closely with the exam teams on many, many different tests. So I'm pretty good at these Microsoft certification things. And one thing I gotta say is I don't just give you the test answers, because that's impossible, because the test is dynamic. They're constantly changing the questions. But I do my best to give you the skills that you need. Now, the test is designed in such a way that it's going to try to test real-world skills. So I want you to have some real experience. I can't make you work in a job for 3 years to get that part of the skills. The point of the certification exam is to show that you have real-world applicable skills. And so some experience is important, but I try to teach you everything I can. And it's really exhaustive, and I cover the heck out of every exam objective, and I give you little winks when I think something might be on the exam. But like I said, I don't have the test answers. The test changes constantly, so nobody does, not anybody within Microsoft. Somebody asked, are there any improvements to VPN access? And what I'll say is that yes and no. There aren't any big improvements. They made some changes to direct access, which isn't really a VPN. Direct access, it acts like a VPN, and then it provides remote access, except that it does it in a very transparent way. So anytime a remote PC happens to have internet access, it can connect back to the corporate network. And it, by default, just channels traffic to the corporate network across that encrypted, almost like a virtual private network connection. It really uses IPsec. And they've made that much easier to implement on the server side. So now it used to be, direct access used to be such a pain to set up. Such a pain, because it used IPv6, and you had to set up all this infrastructure, and who was really using a pure IPv6 network? And so it was a real nightmare to set up. And nowadays you can do it with Windows Server 2012 and Windows 8. You can do it in just a few clicks, literally, and get direct access up and running. So that's, I think, the biggest improvement to VPN access. Somebody asked, I'm concerned with the App Store and how it interfaces with the web. Is there a way to lock it down and prevent control backdoors to the web from apps and Windows, such as the email login? I'll say I'm not concerned about that. If I'm understanding the question correctly, I think they're saying, what's stopping somebody from pretending to be the Microsoft Store and then letting me download fraudulent apps? And the answer is cryptography. Everything is signed. Your computer by default trusts a certificate from Microsoft, and so they can sign apps. Now, if their certificate gets out and then somebody successfully completes a man-in-the-middle attack, if they redirect your DNS to some malicious server and they steal Microsoft's certificate, or they use some heretofore impossible cryptography to forge Microsoft's signed apps, then theoretically they could do it. But I mean, to the limits of modern cryptography and technology, I feel pretty comfortable with the App Store. Now the question, would Windows To Go create a license issue for using it on many PCs when using the USB drives? And I'm not an expert on the licensing topics, but I know that with your volume license agreement, software assurance, which is basically what you need to get Windows 8 Enterprise anyway, with that, they include the ability for a user to run Windows 8 from a USB flash drive. So the flash drive has to stay connected to the computer, so you're not going to be like plugging into a bunch of different things. But basically, they've accommodated for that. Does Windows 8 play nice with older hardware? And the answer is yes and no. I mean, it'll run on basically any modern computer, but I found that it won't run unless the BIOS or firmware has support for DEP, which is data execution prevention. It's a feature of the BIOS that basically stops a section of memory that should just have data from being run as an executable file, and it's a nice little trick that malware uses to launch itself. So if your computer doesn't have that, then it won't run Windows 8. Windows 8 is the first Microsoft operating system to require DEP support, and just about every computer release since Vista came out will have that. I had a Windows XP computer, computer that I bought with Windows XP installed that wouldn't run Windows 8 because it didn't have that. So yes and no. But Windows 8 doesn't use new drivers. So when Vista came out, it required new drivers different from XP, and that became a real pain for everybody because you couldn't get drivers. Windows 8 uses the same drivers as Vista and 7. So there isn't going to be any surprises there. All your accessories will work. It's just a question of whether the BIOS will support DEP and thus Windows 8, but most computers will. Can you take the storage drives you created to another Windows 8 machine if your computer dies to get the information? And the answer is yes, but of course, well, if you don't have resiliency, you'll need to connect all the drives from the storage pool. And if you have resiliency, then, well, if you have a two-way mirror, you could lose a drive and connect it in, or parity, you could lose one drive. If you have a three-way mirror, you could lose two drives. But yes, that information is written into the drives themselves. And of course, Windows 8 is required to recognize it. Windows 7 can't recognize it, but yes. When reinstalling Windows 8, would you always need to put in the 25 key? Oh, do you need a product key when you do a refresh? That is a good question, and I have done so many refreshes, and I do not remember. I'm sorry. I've done at least 20 refreshes because I use it for my virtual machines all the time. And I can't remember if I need to put the product key in or not. Sorry. But I'm also sure that there's a way to encode the product key into the image. So I'm not sure, but I'm also sure that it doesn't have to be a problem if you're creating your custom image, which is hopefully what people do. What about App Locker? Well, it just didn't make my list of top 10 features. Microsoft did extend App Locker. App Locker is this feature that basically gives you control over which apps users can run. So as an IT guy, you can say, Windows 8 can run this app, Windows 8 can't run this app, and you can make a list of approved apps that can run and not let them run anything else, or you can just block specific apps. And basically all that Windows 8 does is extends it to work with Microsoft Store apps. But I'll say it's so much easier to create App Locker rules for Microsoft Store apps than it was for desktop apps, because you don't have to worry about like hashes or publisher signatures. Basically just pick your package, and then all the files in that package are automatically going to work. It'll be able to install and apparently that was the last of the questions. So I guess we're caught up. I had a great time with the presentation. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact me at tony@northrop.org, just like my name. That's Northrup.